Okay, here we are. Okay, thank you, honey. Bye.
Hi,
Are we
people.
all in?
Everybody.
She's
Hi,
getting us.
everybody. I'm sorry, I was talking to Nancy and I realized I had clicked to start. And then I looked and Nancy's like, you got to jump off. I said, yeah, I really do have to jump off because the Zoom isn't opening.
And I
I
wasn't
know.
worried about us. I was thinking, oh, I hope there's nothing majorly wrong before 1 o'clock.
I know, me too.
I was getting really worried. I'm like, it should not be spinning for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know that Heather and Mona were waiting too. Do you see them, Kim, or no?
Yeah, they're coming in.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, Eva.
Hey, Eva, who else am I supposed to be letting in?
So Heidi, I don't know what she has as her last name on it, but Heidi is the survivor that's speaking today, and Brian Aston.
And Brian asked, I see him. Okay.
Yes.
Good. I just want to let everybody, here goes Heidi. And then I'm going to tell everybody, please wait, we'll start soon.
And may I have sharing capability just so I can I would like to share like the last 3
No,
slides and then.
I'm gonna start doing that in a minute.
Okay, thank you. No problem.
Hold on. So,
Hi there.
How are you,
Hi,
Eva?
Hi.
Hi, good day.
all right, I'm making you a co-host. I need to make Brian a co-host as well, right?
Okay.
Brian. And Heidi, I need to make a co-host, right? So she can mute, unmute as she sees fit.
And me?
And then I need to make, oh yeah, Diana, I couldn't find your face. Hold on, Diana, I got you. Diana,
Yeah.
before you do your introductions, when you're ready to start, I'm going to make a brief announcement for FPAs. I'm going to be dropping the continuing education form in the chat.
Yes.
That link to have them fill out so that they can receive continuing education credits.
Okay, so you're gonna do that, and then do you want me to repeat it again? Because Pam asked me to say it.
If you want, actually, if you just want to say it, that'd be fine. It's a continuing education link. And
Right.
then Eva just dropped her survey link. And then I will drop, and it will say it at the end, towards the end, I'll drop it in again.
Okay, so it's a link, not a form.
No, it's a link to a form, but they just
Okay.
tell them to click on that link. I'll give it a title in the chat and tell them to click here.
Sounds good.
Is that your, oh my gosh, Eva, I thought that was my screen and I started clicking like, what did I do? So we have 4 people in the waiting room. Let me know if there's anybody that should be let in. Kasha, Holly. Oh, there goes Cheryl. I accidentally let in one attendee, but that's okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to scarf down my lunch because I had meetings that went back to back to back.
I know.
After this, we have to jump off to the other one.
Yes, yes. So Ava, just so you know,
We
we will
got
have
Lynn
to jump right
Rogers in
off.
here. Is
Yeah,
that-
that's fine.
That's right.
Okay.
We will have to jump right off by 3 o'clock because it's Families Together's one of their other town halls. I think it's child welfare today, I think.
Yeah, we have child welfare today.
Yeah, so we will
Yeah.
all have to be off, you know, a little before 3 to jump on that.
And I will, I have to let you guys know, well, I'm going to make, I'm going to transfer host permission over to who wants to be responsible for ending the meeting. I will give you host permission because then when you hit end, it will end. So that when I leave a little bit early, because I have to prep for that town hall. So I need to be in that room at 5 minutes to.
Mona, can you do that?
Does it have to be one of us or can it be, Eva, so that she just clicks off when they're done talking?
It could be, I can make Eva. Are you fine with that? Okay, good.
Okay, because we all have to do like 2:59 and 30 seconds to get to the other one.
Yeah, and I have it, like
And you're before us, I know, yeah.
crazy. Oh wait, I see, where's Colleen? There she goes. That was who I'm looking for.
I wanted to wish you all congratulations on the town hall yesterday. I was on and I got to see Susan and Nancy and Diana speak yesterday. You guys did very, very well.
Thank you.
Well, actually, it was Kim. It was Kim that was on yesterday.
Kim
right?
was the team leader, yes.
I was yesterday?
Oh, the day before yesterday, whichever day it was. I can't remember.
I think, oh my gosh, it's only Wednesday?
I know, it feels like it's like Tuesday of next week.
Yeah, this week has really got way too many things in it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So if my picture's up there, you'll see the hot pack for the stress on my neck right now. So I'm taking my picture away, people. It's not you that's the stress.
Just
Just
like a
sketch.
scarf.
No, it looks like a scarf.
It
Looks
does.
like you just have a scarf on.
Fuzzy and warm and lumpy, but yes.
If it looks presentable.
Now with Mona and I monitoring the chat, Eva, do you want, will the panel pause and ask for questions? Would you like us to kind of ask some of the questions when there's a lull, or what would be the best way? Wait till the end?
No. So I want to have the open discussion the way we had the presentation. I think it'll be best that way. Of course, in the beginning, when Heidi and Brian are introducing themselves, we should say, after they're done introducing themselves and stating who they are and what they do, then the open Q&A would actually be the last hour of the presentation. So then at that time, or the chat, I don't know how many people are expected on today. So I think that it'd probably be best that everyone submit their questions or comments via chat, unless they raise their hands, and then that way we can, okay, so I don't know, Kim, do you have the mute
Join the
feature on
meeting.
today? And are you unmuting people as they raise their hands? Would you want to do it that way? Or do you want it so that everyone is submitting their questions in the chat box? Maybe I should ask that way.
It's up to you all. I can do it either way. The chat box sometimes can get a little out of control.
Okay,
But I think that if we do a combination of both,
okay.
that will work. I mean, if somebody wants to, we can give them the option. You can type your question in the chat box, or you can use one of the hand raise feature, or any.
I just have a feeling, especially with the questions that came up prior to the presentation and then during the presentation last week, they probably will be more geared towards Brian or Heidi answering them. So it's really up to their comfort, but I think it'll be great if we can have like the live talk. So if they raise their hand, it'll be more manageable that way than for them just to unmute themselves. So then that way, whoever is monitoring that can then unmute the person to raise their hands, and then we can go in that order.
Go in that order. Now, when are we going to start with the questioning? Are people going to be able to talk freely from the jump, or are we going to wait?
Well, to my understanding, I believe that Heidi was going to introduce herself first, and then
Good.
Brian was going to do his introduction and then speak about what he does. So that will probably take up like the first hour of us introducing ourselves. And then in the second hour is when they can do that. And then also I've seen in other panels where people would submit their name in the chat box. So then it's kind of like in the order that they submit their name, then we can choose who's going to ask or, ask their question or make a comment. Does that make sense, Brian? Yeah, because that way it'll be more manageable as opposed to everyone just kind of like jumping in. So I figured the first hour will be all of us introducing ourselves, whatever that introduction will be. And then the Q&A would be the second half.
Okay, however you do it. And again, we can tell if you and Diana could remind people, just use the raise hand feature if they want to be unmuted. I have it set so that people can unmute themselves when they're asked to do so.
Absolutely.
And also stress for them to stay muted if they're not talking, because last time that was
right.
very.
And if at some point there aren't any questions, obviously we gave you a list of questions ahead of time, Ava, and hopefully that would spur other questions from the participants as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Kim, it says Nancy in front of your name, and I know who you are, but every time I see that, I start out with the wrong thing. So Kim, when you're not here, or because of, Ava sharing the feature with you to be the presenter, will she be able to, if somebody's saying something that you don't want on, can you mute them? Can you stop them? Can she open and close that when you jump off?
Oh, you mean, oh yeah, no, before I jump out of this, I'm making Ava the host. So Ava
Right,
will
so
have control.
Join the meeting.
But in that feature of letting people speak, we don't know what the questions will be or won't be, but she'd still have that ability to do the raised hand and take them off of mute, or they
They
unmute
can
themselves.
unmute themselves. Ava, she'll see if they raise hand and she'll call on them. Anything inappropriate that said, that's kind of hard to control, but you know, I know Ava's a pro at doing this, and everybody else that she has brought with her is as well. And trust me, I have no problem with redirection and then keeping you out if necessary, kicking you out if you're that inappropriate.
I was just wondering how that worked.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because sometimes it's just barking dogs and we can't stop it. You know what I mean? So I
We
was
do
wondering.
have one of those Batman ejection.
Excellent. Okay, that's kind of probably what my question was. That was probably the question I didn't know to ask.
We need one of
definitely
those
have
buttons
that.
in real life. The eject
Oh
button.
my God,
Oh my
every meeting that
God.
we're on.
Definitely. So it's 1:04. You want to start in about a minute.
Yes.
We have 32 people. Well, actually, let's see. We have 19 people in the weight room.
Okay, let's let them
Right,
in.
because as they wait, they wonder.
So I'm going to
Yeah.
let them in. And Diana, you're going to bring up the whatchamacallit. Ava, if you could also drop the survey again in for all attendees. I know you have it in the weight room. If we can transfer that for all attendees and remind them again what that's for. Okay, I'm getting ready to admit.
I'm trying to connect.
Join the meeting.
Thank you.
Now, some of you may have noticed that when you came in, I did mute you. I want to just stress before we get going that we all need to stay muted if we're not speaking. And you can unmute when it's time to speak. For those of you who are on a laptop, if you want to do that quite easily, you press your space bar, you will be unmuted. You can ask your question at the time. And when you release the space bar, you will be muted again. That is an easy way to remember. But because this is a very important topic and subject matter, very sensitive, I would appreciate it if we all remain muted unless we are speaking. Thank you so much. Diana?
Welcome, everyone. My name is Diana Mendez, New York City parent advisor, working with Families Together in New York State, along with my colleagues, 9 other parent advisors. Welcome to part 2 of our statewide human trafficking Q&A with live panelists to answer any questions you may have from last week's webinar. At this time, as Kim mentioned, we will have everyone muted, and I ask that everyone mute themselves during the presentation. If you have any questions, we ask that you please use the chat button or raise your hand. We will be putting the continuing education link in the chat so that you can complete it, or you can go into our website, which is Families Together in NewYorkState.org, and you can download it from there. We also ask once again to provide us with a list of any topics that you potentially would like to see us do, in our trainings in the future. Any information that you do give us will be helpful so that we can continue to give you information that may help you with your families. Without further ado, I introduce to you Eva Chavez from Safe Horizons. Safe Horizons is empowering victims and survivors to find safety, support, connection, and hope. Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Safe Horizons, for all you do to help make a positive impact on those victims who have been affected by this worldwide problem. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Diana, and thank you, Families Together, for hosting this very important webinar. This is part 2. So I am Eva Chavez, the Training and Outreach Manager with Safe Horizon Anti-Trafficking Program. I am joined today by the supervising social worker, Brian Aston, the Senior Director, Anita Tika, one of the social workers as well, Heidi True, and most importantly, a survivor client, Heidi. I would like to ask for everyone to remain on mute, please. Please be respectful with your questions. This will be a 2-hour presentation today. So Brian and Heidi will have the opportunity to introduce themselves the first hour and allow them to please share their story and with the work that they do. And in the second half, we will have a live Q&A where you may either unmute yourselves, raise your hand, or put your question in the chat box. We will manage how people are asking their questions. So you do have a question, please put your name in the chat box and we will call the names out accordingly. At this time. Oh, also, if anyone is interested in any collaboration or partnership, if you did not have the opportunity to join our presentation last week, you may be able to request a presentation. I will put up a slide now where you can get my information. You can contact me via email. You can also contact Brian Aston. So at this time, you can have my information here. And I would like to introduce Heidi at this time.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name's Heidi. I am a survivor of labor trafficking, amongst some other things, including domestic violence and sexual assault. My pronouns are she, her, and I also go by they. I just want to start by saying, this isn't my first time, so please feel free to ask questions. Don't feel like you have to hold back. I'm willing to give any experience or information that I can. I'm not only a survivor, but I also work in the fields. I find that it really helps me to heal by helping others that have been through the same thing as I have. I work in a domestic violence shelter right now as a supervisor, and then I work at another domestic violence shelter as a per diem advocate. I work in a residential facility that houses deaf psychiatric adults. I am hard of hearing myself, and I'm fluent in American Sign Language, and I have family members that are deaf. I've had a lot of experience working with people with disabilities as well, autism, Tourette's, all different types of things. So I'm pretty familiar with, the spectrum of disabilities and what that looks like, and then also how that population is affected by the things that we're talking about today. Yeah, I think that's it for right now. Brian can go.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Aston. I'm the supervising social worker for the Anti-Trafficking Program at Safe Horizons. My background, and I saw that a lot of the questions from the previous presentation had a lot to do with, what do we do, with therapy, what's appropriate for adolescents or youth who find themselves in this situation. And so my background is very clinical, I say in quotes because it's, I hate to make that the first thing that I share, but, I think it might be important for us to have that discussion. What do, helpful therapies look like? What do especially youth-focused, trauma-focused therapies for, especially, what we're talking about here. So my background, though, I currently work in private practice. I, of course, supervise social services here. And I previously worked for the Safe Horizons Counseling Center, which I'll mention actually throughout this. Again, I took a look at some of the questions that some of you had from the previous presentation, and it will be a helpful resource for me to discuss because I know that some of you are looking for very practical resources. Where do we go, right? So we recognize that this is a very serious issue. And so part of what I'll be sharing is, what do we do next? As professionals, I'm not sure how many professionals versus parents there are in this group, but, for those who are professionals, how do you intervene, particularly in families where there is human trafficking for youth? If there are parents in the room, I'm sure that what Heidi was just saying, that'll be maybe interesting for you all to hear, but I'm also certainly happy to talk about, what does therapy look like? What do the next steps look like for families who find themselves in these situations? So I'm happy to be here. And like Eva said, if you want to talk privately, maybe on the side, if maybe you suspect that someone or your child, anything, you're always more than welcome to reach out to us. We provide not only, of course, direct services to survivors of all ages, but we also provide technical assistance, meaning if you just have a question, what is this? How do I identify it? I have, especially for very specific instances, we certainly have professionals across the city in different fields, like in hospitals and nonprofits, that call us and just ask, what do you think? How should we help this person? So if anything that comes up for you today that you feel you want to talk about in private, you can always reach out to me here with what Eva has on the screen. You can call me or you can email me, and I'm always happy to set up a time and, we can talk through whatever's happening. So yeah, I look forward to today. And, you'll also learn a lot more about Safe Horizon as we go along here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Heidi. As Brian just mentioned, some information that may be shared today may be triggering. So if you have to step away from your computer, please do so at your device, however you're tuning in today. Don't forget to take your deep breaths throughout the training today or throughout the conversations. I'll remind everyone to take their grounding breaths. And that's just 2 deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. You can do a 4 count in your head. And if you need to step away, get a glass of water, something to drink, please do so at your leisure. I would also like to introduce the Senior Director, Anita Tika, if you don't mind unmuting yourself at this time.
Thanks, Eva, and thank you to everybody who's come out today. It's, we love presenting to as many external and internal audiences as we can about human trafficking and looking at all of the different intersections between human trafficking and a plethora of other vulnerabilities that clients may be experiencing that aren't always recognized or identified. And so I really commend you for taking this training today and engaging with this panel discussion. And please, as Brian and Eva both said, do not hesitate to reach out to us if you ever have any questions related to human trafficking or possible human trafficking or victim services, and we can make sure that we can connect you to the right program. So thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you all do every day as well.
Thank you, Anita. So at this time, Heidi, if you don't mind, can you please share your background on your situation, anything you're comfortable with sharing at this time, and also how this led you to the work that you're doing today, and how you came about coming to Safe Horizon and the services you were able to receive through Safe Horizon and continue receiving.
Yeah. So my story doesn't necessarily start with the trafficking situation. I probably have to give you a little more background in order to fully understand how I got into the field. So I would say I'll start when I was in high school. Around that time, I started learning a lot about domestic violence and intimate partner violence. I was pretty naive. I didn't really have any serious relationships by that time. So I was in my first relationship when I was learning about domestic violence. And this relationship ended up being very much so abusive in every way. It started, with more emotional, psychological, gaslighting, things that are harder to see and point out. And then, it escalated to sexual and physical. So I was in that relationship for about 3 years, from the time that I was 16 to the time that I was 19. And in my first year of college, I was sexually assaulted multiple times. And I didn't really have anyone to go to about these things. I didn't have a strong support system. And I think that I felt a sense of resentment in a way toward my mom specifically. I was raised with a single mom. When my parents were together, they were in an abusive situation. And I think that I resented the fact that my mom wasn't able to understand that I was in an abusive situation in my high school and early college years. And I was receiving a lot more punishment than understanding. And I think that it was viewed very much in a way that it was a young relationship. This is just, a phase, and it's just young love. This is no big deal. And, I was really struggling, and I needed her to see that. So after my first year in college, I decided to take a break because of the sexual assaults. It was too overwhelming for me, and I wasn't able to succeed academically and put my full effort into it. So rather than returning home, I was living with my abusive ex until we broke up, and then I decided that I would prefer to be, homeless or couch surfing, staying in my car, than to return to my home life. So I ended up in some not so great situations, and a lot of what I was doing at this time in order to cope with everything that I was going through was using substances to basically alter my reality of the trauma and everything that was too overwhelming for me to bear. So I ended up getting into trouble with the police, and I was mandated into a treatment program. And so at this time, I still didn't really have a great support system, but I didn't have anywhere to live. And my mom had a friend whose girlfriend was looking for an au pair. So, my mom said, "Hey, my daughter's great with kids and she knows how to cook. She's worked in restaurants before. I think she would be great for this situation." So, and of course, I needed somewhere to go because I was mandated into the program. I needed somewhere to live in a very specific area that would be approved. Um, so I moved into the house. It was a live-in position. I lived in the basement. And the situation that was agreed upon changed very quickly from my responsibilities, the privacy and the amount of time that I would have to work, um, how I would be treated, how much I would be paid. All of these things became
Joined the meeting.
different than what was agreed upon in the beginning. So it was just a very uncomfortable, abusive situation. She knew that I didn't have anywhere else to go. I was very upfront with the things that I was going through and the fact that I was in this drug treatment program, why I was in the drug treatment program. I allowed her to ask me any questions because I wanted her to know that she could feel comfortable with me around her children, even though they were older. I wanted her not to feel like she didn't know who was living in her house. So she really knew, about my program, the fact that I wasn't allowed to have police contact, the fact that I had to maintain, a consistent, safe address, and they needed to know where I was at all times, and just all of the stipulations that came with the situation I was in. And so at this time, I was basically I started volunteering to kind of escape from the situation, because even though I didn't recognize the au pair job as trafficking, I just thought it was, kind of a crappy situation that I couldn't get myself out of for the next year, because that's what I agreed upon. So I stayed there for the whole year, and I actually started volunteering as a hospital advocate, where I would go to the hospital overnight whenever someone came to the hospital with injuries sustained as a result of sexual assaults, human trafficking, or domestic violence. So similar to the time that I was going through domestic violence, it was like I started learning about trafficking while I was in my trafficking situation. And I still wasn't able to recognize, that that's what it was until after I was out of the situation. So I started volunteering, and I basically just threw myself into volunteering. I was taking any and every shift. I was, staying up all night. I was in school, and I was just trying to do everything to distract myself, kind of how I had done in the past. But now I couldn't do that with substances anymore, so I had to find other things that I could that I can do to distract from basically everything that was going on in my life. So I actually was able to secure a job where I was volunteering, and I was the rape crisis coordinator, and I was in charge of all of the hospital cases that the agency had. that were related to, like I said before, sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, as well as child abuse, specifically child sexual abuse. And we would go to the Child Advocacy Center and accompany the guardians or the parents and the kids whenever there was any sort of suspected potential abuse, whether it was physical or sexual, but we saw a lot more sexual. And then, so I worked there for about 1.5 years, and I really enjoyed the field and working with survivors, and just, like I said before, it really, I think that I healed a lot through helping others. So I actually was able to get promoted from this job, and now I'm in the job that I'm in currently. I'm a supervisor at a domestic violence shelter in Westchester County. I actually work at both of the domestic violence shelters in Westchester County. And I've been at this job for almost 2.5 years now. And we serve both domestic violence and human trafficking. And so it wasn't until I got this job that I started seeking. My trafficking situation, just to clarify, was 2017 to 2018. So it wasn't until I got to this job that I realized that there were a lot of things that human trafficking survivors were entitled to, like that you could apply for if you get state certified as a survivor. So I started working with Restore, which is in New York City, and they didn't have any counseling available, but they put me in contact with Safe Horizon. And then I also luckily had a connection at my current job that knew someone at Safe Horizon as well. So I called Safe Horizon, and that's how I was able to start getting set up with the free counseling that they have there. And it's been amazing because, you know, I feel like it's been kind of difficult for me as someone who works in the field to receive counseling services, because at my first job when I was a volunteer, I was receiving counseling, and then I got a job there, so I could no longer receive counseling. And I'm not able to really financially pay for anything, or really the therapy that I need, that places like Safe Horizon offer. And I've been at Safe Horizon now, I think, for, I want to say, over 1 year. And I've worked with 2 different therapists, and they've both been amazing. One of them is my fellow Heidi, and I'll shout her out because she's on this call, but she has been just one of the biggest supports that I've had. And I think that's something that I want to emphasize, is just, if you ever see someone going through a rough time, regardless of if it's trafficking or what it is, just to be supportive and try to meet them where they're at and get them to the point where they want to receive counseling and they want to work through whatever it is that they've been through. Because I think that if I had that support, I would have started getting help a lot sooner than I did. And maybe it would have prevented some more abusive situations.
Thank you so much for sharing, Heidi. At this time, Brian, so I'd like to remind you, so Families Together services families of those with children, either minors and adults, that live with autism and other types of disabilities. So if you can share your work that you've done with either minors and adults of those living with disabilities that have been in a trafficking situation.
Yeah, thank you. So I previously, like I mentioned, I used to work at a place, the same agency, the Safe Horizon Counseling Center, and there I was a trauma therapist. So the therapy that I'll be kind of mostly referencing throughout this is called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of people have heard of CBT. I think it's probably one of the more common types of therapies out there, but basically you're trying to look at what are, unhealthy or not thoughts and feelings that maybe that you want to change, that you want to, adjust, that's maybe making you feel overwhelmed or however it is. Excuse me. So with TFCBT, of course, the main component of it is that it's trauma focused. And so I'm specifically mentioning this too because it's really only meant to be used with kids. Also, regardless of disability, I mean, if we're talking about other like cognitive issues going on where there's maybe not an ability to understand what's happening, you know, there's certainly other therapies. I think that would be more appropriate. But if we're talking about autism, and I hate to say high functioning, I know that's not really the language. I mean, some people use it, some people don't. So for today, we will kind of use that language of high functioning. But so I guess when we're talking about PFCBT, we're talking about oftentimes, you know, kids who can really be in the therapy with their parents. So anyway, yes, I worked with a few kids before who were not only trafficked, but also they were sexually abused. And so I think that many of us in this room could probably point to risk factors, you know, for these kids who have found themselves being abused, especially by strangers or people who are at school. And so can you kind of repeat the question, Eva? You know, what specifically, just kind of like, what does that look like, the treatment or?
Sure. So I know some of the questions had kind of leaned on the treatment modalities of those. And I know they also wanted to know like the intersection of those living with a disability, suicide rates, substance abuse, and human trafficking.
Thank you. Yeah. And so, right, that piece especially stood out to me when Heidi was talking, right, that when we're working with people, particularly with kids, where there's already a feeling like maybe people don't understand, especially I think when we're working with children with any kind of disability, it's already a pretty isolating experience for kids. I mean, unless they have a community already, or they have other kids in school that maybe they can relate to or know them. But I think the first thing that always comes to mind when it comes to disabilities, whether it's an adult or as a child, I think oftentimes is some form of isolation, feeling maybe a bit different or separate from others. So what can that do? What does it feel like when you're isolated? I mean, first of all, like what Eva was saying, there's certainly an intersection with isolation and suicidal ideation, right? Feeling like you don't want to be here anymore. Feeling like this place isn't for me. And so certainly, I think always the first thing that we want to look out for is what do these social supports look like? Oftentimes when people, especially youth, I think, perhaps are in some abusive relationships or are in trafficking situations, what our program has usually seen is that maybe there are other supports that are lacking in their lives, right? Maybe there aren't as many friends to talk to. Maybe there's a parent, kind of like what Heidi was saying. Maybe there's a parent who is not only not supporting you, but is almost kind of reinforcing this idea that maybe you should just be in this relationship. And so I think the first thing that always comes to mind, especially when we're talking about youth, is what do the relationships in their lives look like, especially with their parents? I mean, you know, when we're talking about therapy and any type of, well, the type of therapy that I practice, you know, you look at most therapies, it looks at what happened when you were a child, you know, what happened when your parents weren't there, or perhaps there were, you know, abandonment issues. I mean, there's so many things that we can look to. But specifically when we're talking about disability, again, the first thing that always comes to mind is what do the supports look like? What does the child's social life look like? What does the child's home life look like? If things look amiss, if they are in their room more, they are maybe talking to people that you've never heard of, right? We want to ask, you know, in a very supportive way. I think that I want to kind of keep that theme with what Heidi was saying, that nothing is going to happen, regardless of who the person is, if there's no alliance developed right from the start. If there's disbelief or anything to suggest that what they're doing or what situation they're in is their fault, you might as well not ask at all, quite frankly, because especially a child who already is struggling with whatever disability it is that we're talking about, fill in the blank. it's not going to go well. I mean, just very simply. And so, you know, we can certainly, I think as time goes on, as this presentation goes on, I know that I saw a question from someone, I think from the last time is, well, what does that look like? To actually ask someone, is there, you know, is human trafficking happening? Of course, that's not how we would ask it, but that's kind of the gist that I was getting from people. So anyway, I think that the thing that I want everyone to keep in mind is, what does this child's life look like? You have to imagine it, right? Are they alone? What are they seeking out as a result of that? So yeah, we can certainly go on about that, but I want that to kind of be the main point, I guess, that we focus on, because I think especially when we're talking about kids who are disabled, we're already talking about kids who, more often than not, from society standards, are not really accepted. And so how do we accept them even further if something really terrible has happened to them? So anyway, those are my kind of initial thoughts on it. But I'd be curious if there, you know, something more specific, and we can kind of keep discussing it as it goes on.
Absolutely, thank you. So I was going to read from some of the questions that were submitted by the parent advisors. From Heather, we have, so I think you may have answered this already. What are some practical steps, solutions, and tools for persons working with the youth who is known to be in a trafficking situation? And especially if they repeatedly elope from the program, and what concrete suggestions can the panel make?
So I guess, I mean, I'm going to talk from Safe Horizons perspective, that we are, first of all, we're a voluntary organization in all aspects. Well, most. I think there's maybe one or two instances where there are some non-voluntary programs, but overall, I'll say that just from our perspective, we're a voluntary program. Now, how much does voluntary and youth go together? Sometimes not well, unless there is mandate, right? Someone, I think the word that was used in there even was elope from the program. And so what is causing them to elope? So the type of treatment setting, it sounds like that's being referenced is maybe like a residential treatment, which exists for kids, particularly youth who've been trafficked. So that's always an option, right? Across New York, there are all sorts of residential treatment facilities that are inpatient, kind of a lockdown type situation. All the way to the other side of the spectrum to where we have voluntary programs like ours. And a surprising number of kids are voluntary, you know, or who seek out services on their own. So I want to kind of mention that as well. So what happens if someone elopes? Again, in the one or two times that I've worked with someone where they were mandated to be here, we want to understand what brought them here, right? There's usually some sort of case, there's usually some form of maybe law enforcement action that brought them. So just the fact that they're maybe in somewhere where they don't want to be, something already happened that they didn't want to happen. So now they're taking back some form of control by saying, I've already been arrested, I've already been abused, I've already been fill in the blanks. And so I think that it's a way for them to also maintain control. So even the language around it, right? Is it eloping, or are they reacting to uncontrollable external events? You know what I mean? Of course they don't want to be there. Who would? You know, and so to me, I've had that response, I've given that response to someone. I understand why you wouldn't want to be there. I understand it's very scary. You're going from one scary situation to the next, particularly when we're talking about people that are kind of mandated. I think that Heidi might have mentioned that in her story, right? And I'd be kind of curious to know what that was like for Heidi to have been, you know, kind of in a mandated situation. Now, I understand that there are times with some youth where mandating is necessary, right? We're talking about ACS. We're talking about just times where we're at our wit's end, you know, as parents, and we don't know what to do. And so I understand also on the parent side that anywhere that your child can be where they're not being trafficked. Oh, sorry, I was reading. Okay, so Okay, good. So then there are lots of, okay, so we're talking about lots of different kids here. Okay. So we're talking about all sorts of disabilities. We're talking about all sorts of issues with mental health, with substance use. So, I mean, what I'm saying here today is not going to even scratch all of these different, but I think that the thing that we're really going to be stressing, and I'm so glad that, again, Heidi brought this up, is you've got to develop this alliance at first, to understand what it is that's maybe drawing them to these people, to drugs. You know, more often than not, I mean, with substance use, I'd be kind of curious to know what came first. Did they start using drugs first, or did they start using drugs as a result of some form of abuse that they were experiencing as a child? So, right, we talk about all these issues. We talk about even mental health. Is the child depressed because they have no friends? Or are they depressed because something bad did happen and they felt like they couldn't share it with someone? So now the way that it's presenting is depressed and aggressive, and they can't sit still in class. I would say the most common, you know, diagnoses that we would see for kids would be ADD, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder. Hello, that's a big one. All of these things, depending on the history, you know, it's more often related to some form of trauma that that person experienced. Now, sometimes ADD, ADHD, all these things exist separate from that. But what we've seen in our counseling center is that, particularly for youth who come in, it seems like they're just all over the place. You know, they're skipping school, they are not coming home when they're supposed to. They are just all around truancy. And usually what we found is, some point along the way, someone didn't listen. Someone didn't believe them. Someone said, you know, who cares? So of course, what else are you supposed to do but turn inward and, you know, beat yourself up or try your best, you know, well, if they don't care, maybe this person clearly does care because they're here, you know, this abuser does care because they're consistent, you know, they're with me, they ask about me. So anyway, I'm kind of going off on to several topics here and kind of different, but I want to kind of really make the point that the way that we first react to this person and to this youth, regardless of anything else, is going to set the tone for what happens next. I can guarantee it. Okay, and then the second piece of this chat that just came through of how is this population vulnerable? How is this population of vulnerable individuals? How can they be targeted for trafficking? So again, I mean, one thing that I mentioned was isolation. You know, we talk about a lot of issues where there's lack of resources, right? One of the biggest things that we see with a lot of youth is let me start that over. What I've often heard from some of our clients, we have a lot of adult clients who've experienced youth as who've experienced trafficking as youth, and what we so often hear is these somewhat material things are actually so alluring. So what we usually hear is, okay, someone meets a man. Let's assume that this person is female. They meet a man and then they make them promises, right? That's usually the way that people can be drawn in, right? There are promises that are made. Promises that sound, you know, pretty nice, depending on who you are. If you're someone who grew up with very little, and especially in this day and age, in 2021, where we have constant access to social media, comparing ourselves against other people, especially youth. I mean, if any of us can remember what it was like to be kids, and you saw the other kid wearing, you know, the new shoes, or they had, you know, the new jacket, whatever it is, there's part of that where we can maybe even understand a bit, if there's someone who's coming up to you and flashing all of these things in front of you as a very vulnerable child, maybe grew up in such a way that, again, you didn't have much. Maybe you're already vulnerable because of some form of other disability, right? When we're talking about autism, when we're talking about really anything that can make someone seem nice, right? Because they are. No one ever comes up to you and says, hey, I'm going to human traffic you, you know, come with me or else. It's always very gentle. It's always, so nice, you know, well, I could get you this, you know, I can give you money, I can buy you gifts, I can give you something to eat. And so these, you know, so we're not talking about vulnerabilities like these, some of them are so massive, some of them are so subtle, in that, you know, even a McDonald's meal, you know, if you're 12 years old or 13 years old, is appealing. So to me, vulnerability in this aspect, we're talking about disabilities, which of course has its own inherent vulnerabilities, just because of how people perceive those with disabilities, I think. But also, you know, just from their family life, you know, again, we look at how are they growing up? What do they not have? And it's not always about that, but it is something that we do typically see, something that, you know, flashiness and, you know, some designer stuff. So yeah, I'm kind of talking about, yeah, Heidi, I'd love for you to jump in.
Yes, I wanted to point out something that I've noticed, both from personal experience and then also from people that I've seen either in my work or in my personal life. When I was growing up, I mentioned before that I'm hard of hearing and my younger brother's deaf. And I feel like we were taught to be very compliant. And we were taught to be kind of, I mean, in our situation specifically, we had a kind of a difficult home life. So we were kind of just flies on the wall. It was just kind of don't cause trouble, don't bring any unnecessary attention to yourself because you're already different. So I know when I was growing up, I was very, very shy. So I think that just having that mindset and just kind of being raised that way, I think in a way it's almost a vulnerability because from a very young age, I was taught not to fight back or not to cause trouble and to just kind of, you know, do what I was told, especially from authority figures or from people that had more power than I did. So it wasn't uncommon for me to not stand up for myself. And that wasn't really something I started doing until I was older. And just to touch on the treatment program that I was in, I think that for me, it was very beneficial to be mandated, but I noticed that for others, it wasn't so much the case. In my situation, I really needed those supports. My counselor at the drug treatment program became like my second mom because my mom wasn't close. She was out of state. So she was a huge support for me at that time when I was going through the court and everything. And just having the support of other people that were going through similar things as me, whether it was the court or whether, you know, I made some girlfriends in the group and they disclosed to me that they've been through similar traumas, and then we bonded through that, as well as the coping with substances. So it was beneficial to me, but it's not always beneficial being mandated. And I lost some friends in the program that were mandated because they weren't able to stop their substance use. I feel like there was something else I wanted to say, but I'm not remembering. Hold on one second. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. I wanted to just to say for me that my arrest was really a blessing in disguise, because when I became sober was the first time that I really had to start to deal with my traumas, and confront what I had been through over the past couple years. And that's when I really started to speak up and start fighting for myself. And I found a lot of, I was very empowered by starting to tell my story. And I became a victim impact speaker around that time. Just speaking to people. I've gone into jails, you know, I've gone to colleges and universities to speak about all different types of things that I've been through. And every time that I speak, always someone comes forward. There's not a single time that I speak that someone doesn't have a similar experience that I did. And I think that just over time, I realized how prevalent all of the things that I've been through, unfortunately, are. As a woman, as someone who's disabled, as someone in the LGBTQ community, just so many different things that I've experienced are so common. And especially human trafficking, I think it's one of the things that our society hasn't really realized how prevalent it is yet. Sexual assault and domestic violence, we are kind of like, yes, we've accepted that that happens often. But human trafficking is still this foreign thing that we don't realize. A lot of the situations we see on a daily basis or might come in contact with are in fact trafficking, and we just don't have the awareness and education to realize it.
Heidi, I was kind of curious. I mean, what came to mind was, and I guess with all the parents here, I mean, how do you wish your mom had responded? Because I mean, that to me seems like such an important part of it, where like, the response from just parents, I mean, anyone who you think is important. I'm curious, how do you wish she had responded? And maybe that would help people also understand more what to say.
Right. So my dad wasn't very present. He was kind of the breadwinner. So he was always at work. And when he was home from work, he was sleeping. So my mom was really the one that was always involved with us. And then eventually she left my dad and she was a single mom. But I think our relationship was very complex because from a young age, I wasn't really a child. I was also a co-parent. I had to become a caregiver of my younger brother. So a lot of times the lines and the roles of responsibilities would kind of be blurred. So as I got older, it was almost like I was paying bills and I was working and I was really helping her out as a single mom. But at the same time, she was punishing me and treating me like a child for things that were happening in my DV situation. So I think that really it was a lack of support and a lack of understanding. I was kind of just, it feels like I was being punished for what I was going through. And I've met other people that have felt similarly because of the change in behavior that you kind of mentioned before, Brian. Like if someone drastically changes their behavior or starts having different friends or starts doing different things, oftentimes if parents freak out, their first reaction is going to be to punish, and then there's just like automatically a disconnect. So I think that just throughout my DV situation when I was 16 to 19, the disconnect just became larger and larger between me and my mom because she just wasn't understanding and she wasn't supporting, even though I was showing her all the signs that I needed her, And also I'll share when I was younger, I went through a lot of things when I was younger as well. And when I was 6, I started pulling out my eyelashes and I had an anxiety disorder. And I struggled with that until I was in about 8th grade. And that was, kind of just me as an overwhelmed 6-year-old, not knowing how to deal with all of the things that were going on in my life. But instead of seeing it as a cry for help, it was more like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? And every time you would see me doing it, it's like, stop that, yell at me, instead of saying like, what's wrong? Why are you doing that? So I think that the approach has to be one that's more supportive and trying to understand, as opposed to always making it like there's something wrong with you, because we already have things that are wrong with us if we have disabilities. So going through additional things, like Brian was saying, it's just more isolating, especially if you already feel like your parents or your siblings or whoever in the family that don't have the same condition as you or whatever the experience is, you might not feel like they understand. And then things like this just builds greater distance in the relationship.
I feel like the thing that I kept kind of hearing through that too, and with a lot of people, is that human trafficking doesn't also happen just randomly, or in a vacuum. And so we see that there's all these other things in people's lives that kind of lead up to it, right? I mean, there are certainly biological vulnerabilities, that's what we're talking about.
2 days.
There are certainly biological vulnerabilities that we're talking about that, we can't always help. We can just do the best that we can to support and, make sure that that child has all the resources that they need to support and, really maybe even accept disability to a degree. But then we also add in all these other factors in life. We add in perhaps having a single parent, perhaps having a responsibility as a very young child to care for other siblings in the household. And all these things are not, just Heidi specific. I think that maybe a lot of us maybe even know people in our lives, or some of us are those people, right? Where growing up with a single parent household, and again, that's not all that it is, right? That's not just, it's certainly a vulnerability, but it's not the only thing, right? It's always in, you add it all up. Not that it also adds up to human trafficking always, but it's important to recognize that when we see people, particularly youth, involved in very scary situations, domestic violence, human trafficking, it didn't just happen. It didn't just start with that person who is causing harm. And it's a complicated thing to say, that it does start at home, but to a degree, there are so many factors that go into it. And so we have to be understanding that it's also not just this one thing, that there are so many vulnerabilities that can we prevent everything that can happen as a result of someone having some form of what we perceive as a vulnerability? Absolutely not. Can we support people the best that we can? We're not saying go out and do whatever you want. We're saying, it seems like you're in pain right now. How can I help you? It seems like, if you see a child pulling their hair out, right? I mean, that's a real condition, trichomania, right? That's not what a child should be doing, right? And so all of these things, as I was also listening to Heidi and just kind of reflecting on all the people we work with, there was something else that happened. There's something else in this person's history that we also need to be paying attention to, not just what's happening in the moment. Because if we're just paying attention to what's happening in the moment, then we're continuing to ignore this person and what happened before. Now, there are times, I'm sure, I'm not saying nothing is 100%, but there are certainly times where someone, maybe there weren't so many vulnerabilities. They grew up in what we perceive to be, a loving household, and later on, still, are victimized or are pulled into the cycle. So, I'm not saying that it's always childhood abuse, it's always some form of what the child is lacking, but more often than not, if a young person finds themselves in that situation, there's something else happening. And we really have to really pay attention to what else is happening except for human trafficking, and including the human trafficking. So I really wanted to highlight that point, because I think that Heidi's story also really demonstrates that. It's so complex, and that we have to think about it in a very complex way.
Thank you, Brian. There was a question posted in the chat that's directed towards Heidi. Heidi, can you talk about what helped and what harmed you in terms of moving through your experience?
I think that Brian mentioned before that a lot of times there are situations where you're not listened to or you're not believed. And I mean, in most of the situations I experienced, that was kind of the case, and in the domestic violence situation, I grew further and further away from my friends because I was never with anyone other than my boyfriend. And they didn't recognize that that wasn't healthy, or that things that I maybe had shared with them were really considered abuse. They just kind of didn't know how to support me, and we grew apart. And then, you know, going through the sexual assault, the first person I told didn't believe me because she was friends with the people that did it. So I didn't disclose for another 4 years or so, because that was when I got sober. And, you know, I said, I just want to report it. I want to see what happens from this. And the police were great. They were really enthusiastic about my case, which, working in the field, is not always what we see. So I was kind of prepared for the worst. And really, it wasn't until I came in contact with like the district attorney and people that would have to prosecute the case where it was a roadblock. And I actually had a meeting, and I brought an advocate with me, and basically I sat there and I was victim blamed by the supervisor about everything that I did wrong as to what led to my sexual assault, and what the other people that were interviewed in the case said, and basically why they had more credibility than I did. And then, you know, in the leading to the trafficking situation, like I said before, there's not really a knowledge of human trafficking. I barely could even understand and recognize when I was going through the situation, because I was only learning about trafficking myself. And especially when you hear about human trafficking, they really don't focus on the labor trafficking. You hear a lot about sex trafficking and what that looks like. So it, like I said, it wasn't until after I left the situation and I started learning more about labor trafficking that I realized something's not quite right with the experience that I went through. Of course, I knew that it was not a great experience, and I was not happy with what I had to go through, but I didn't know it was trafficking until after the fact. But I think what helped me is the few people that did believe me and did validate my experience. You know, when I started volunteering, that was the first time that I had like trauma-informed therapy and counseling at my first job. And then from then on, that was all I looked for. So that's kind of also what led me to Safe Horizon. So I think that just making my mental health a priority, because I've been through all of these things. And, you know, even though I work in the field, I'm still on my own journey, and I need to have as much support as possible. And there's things that come up every day, you know. The trafficking situation could have been years upon years ago, and you think that you're over it and, you know, you're kind of healed from it, and then something will happen one day that brings you right back. And I had an experience like that the other day with domestic violence. But it's just something that we're always working through. It's always going to be a part of you. But it's just about, like I said before, the support. And I think being very intentional with not blaming or punishing the person, pointing out what they did wrong in the situation, but rather being supportive and kind of validating, and just being there for them, being more understanding.
Thank you for sharing that, Heidi. That brings me to the point that I wanted to share with everyone. There were a couple of questions that were asked prior to today's panel about training that different agencies and organizations receive. I can't answer that right off the back, but this is the reason why this presentation is important and this training is important. You'll be surprised as to how many organizations and agencies don't receive human trafficking training, especially on labor and sex trafficking. Some may have trauma-informed care and client support practice, as Brian had mentioned before, and then some don't. So it's really important that we're educated, therefore we can identify, we can prevent, and we can intervene when we do acknowledge and recognize that someone may be trafficked. The questions We have detection questions that are specific to both labor and sex trafficking, asking someone if they're doing something that, are they being made to do something that they don't want to do? Are they allowed to keep in touch with their family and friends? Are they even able to attend school or go to work? Some people have been identified by their medical providers or at their faith-based organizations. So it's very important that we get everyone educated on this. And so I worked with the state for many years, and there were certain trainings that I didn't receive. CSEC, human trafficking, were two of the most important trainings that I had no idea of, that I didn't receive until I actually came to work for Safe Horizon back in July of 2020. So it's really important that all organizations or agencies, regardless of the entity, whether we're working in the communities, medical providers, faith-based organizations, community centers, state agencies such as Families Together, who's under OMH, it's important that we all receive this training. Someone just, Heidi, you would like to also speak on human trafficking resources? Yes, absolutely. In Westchester County, it's important that we hit all the different counties. There was someone, I believe, one of the parent advisors said that they were very far and few upstate. And we're here in New York State, that's a huge state, but you don't find too many resources in different counties once we leave out of New York City. So it's important that we spread the awareness of this and advocate for those that feel like they don't have a voice, and for those that are speaking for those that don't have a voice, such as myself, Brian, Heidi, Families Together, that have requested this training. And we want to make sure that we get everyone trained, libraries, after school centers, schools from elementary school to high school, colleges, all type of organizations and entities that you could think of. Heidi, you wanted to speak on the resources in Westchester.
Sure. In terms of the first question that you were stating, in Westchester County, there is a anti-human trafficking task force that is spearheaded by really my sister's place and the town of Pound Ridge Police Department. Chief Ryan's really involved. So they have meetings monthly, and they are super involved in Westchester County. In terms of agencies that are providing education and services, there's my sister's place. They're very involved in, like you were saying, providing education, not just to schools, but faith-based organizations, medical place practices, just everywhere you can think of that would need education, which is pretty much everywhere. And Hope Store does very similar work. Who am I missing? I know that, so my sister's place and Victims Assistance Services actually train the police on domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Every time there's a class of cadets, they have to go through certain presentations, and those agencies go and train the cadets with all the information they need and the resources and what to do, what to look for, all of those things. Westchester Medical Center also now has the SAVE program, which is similar to the work that I was talking about before, where there's advocates whenever someone goes to the hospital as a result of sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking. And they're very involved in like the task force and all of that as well.
Thank you for the information, Heidi. I see Brian has his hand up for a question. You may go ahead and unmute yourself at this time.
Everything we? Oh, I didn't have a question.
Brian Barr. Yeah, Brian Barr. He has his hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, Ava,
Yes.
are you acknowledging me?
Yes, Brian. I just asked for you to go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Ava. Heidi, you are an amazing person, and thank you so much for sharing. A question, Heidi, when you reflect, I mean, you've done so much growth, so much professional growth, and now you're professionally sharing and helping others grow and build their own lives, all based upon your own tremendous resilience. when you think, Heidi, of the young Heidi, what it might have been for those of us in the field reaching out to the young person in trying to throw them a line of connectedness that can reach through their withdrawal and their hesitancy to come back into the mainstream and get reconnected or connect, whichever it may be. What do you think, Heidi? What tools or what kinds of things might we do as people wanting to help that's going to cut through this distance that seems to exist between the helping adult and the young person who's tuned off to our efforts to reach them? Any thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Brian.
Yeah, well, thank you, Heidi.
For your kind words. So I think that one of the big things that could have benefited me is a more strengths-based approach. Rather than focusing on all of the problems, either in the behavior or what's going on in the person's life, just focusing on, just really approaching it kind of just how you were just approaching me. Like, if you know that there's a youth that's been through a lot and you approach it saying, yeah, wow, you've been through a lot, but you're so resilient and
Yes.
you're really good at problem solving and you're really good at this, and just building them up and empowering them. Because I think that, especially in schools and institutions and treatment programs, residential, whatever, a lot of times there may not be a focus on what someone's doing well. There's a lot of focus on what their disability is or how that's impacting them in school or what their grades are, and if they're not doing well. But there's not really, I know that it took a long time for people to realize that the issues I was going through were because of trauma.
Yeah.
I think that there wasn't a focus on that. It wasn't like you would point out the problems, but you would never dive deep as to why are these problems occurring. So I think that, really just being there for the youth and pointing out their strengths and being just an understanding, supportive figure goes a really long way, not just focusing on, what they're doing wrong, what they're doing bad, punitive measures, but really just trying to be a positive force in their life.
Yeah, that's tremendously helpful, Heidi, because I gathered from you have tremendously you articulate so well, and that's why I'm really so grateful you're doing this, because I think a lot of young people really desire to share and bring clarity to their issues, but they don't have the communication skill that you do. And I kept picking up in your explanation, your description of things, particularly the maternal relationship, was you would act and mother would respond by punishment. And that was an immediate repressive situation, which just further pushed you down and pushed you away. And it was smothering as I was hearing it.
Yeah, I would say that it probably had a huge impact on my self-esteem. And it wasn't until I was older and, I went through the period of time where I became sober and I started speaking up about different things and I felt more empowered that, my self-esteem started to improve and I became more confident. But as a child, I was very insecure and I was very shy.
I didn't have a very good self-esteem, and I just kind of tried to be quiet and not attract attention to myself, because I didn't want any reason for punishment or any negative attention or anything like that, because like I said, I'm already different. So I really didn't want any extra attention on me.
Yes. Well, boy, please keep sharing, Heidi, because you really bring a light to the issues. And I know I've gained so much listening to you, and I bet our other participants have too. Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Ava.
Thank you, Brian. So there was a question posed, if a provider suspects that someone in their program is being trafficked, what can they do? In the chat box, I have submitted the New York State Central Register number for the general public and for the mandated reporters. So I believe that those who are providing services to vulnerable persons in specific programs will be mandated reporters. So if they suspect that someone's being trafficked and they ask them and they may have disclosed that they have or not, they can still call the mandated number here. And you can also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I'll put this number here again. And you can also call us at the Anti-Trafficking Program for different resources that we provide here as well. If someone does disclose that they are in a trafficking situation and are afraid of leaving and don't know how to get out the situation, they can text help to Be Free, which is 233-733. And as Heidi said, you want to validate them, you want to empower them. You also want to come up with a safety plan. Some may not be able to leave right when you ask them to. Some may have to plan their escape. There may be caregivers to children. As Heidi said, she was a domestic worker and she was providing, not a domestic partner, she was an au pair and she was providing services to children. You can't just leave a situation if you're responsible for underage children. One, you can't leave them alone because you can get charged with neglect, and you can't take them with you because you can get charged with kidnapping. So these are some information here that you can give to the persons, and especially if you're a mandated reporter, please call that number. I see there's some questions. Okay, so Safe Harbor. Yeah, Safe Harbor is another program. Thank you, Heidi. At this time, if there are any questions among the participants, you may ask them during this next 45 minutes. You can either post your questions in the chat box or you can raise your hand.
While everyone is doing that, I'd like to also, with regards to what Heidi was saying and the question that Brian had for her, it kind of made me think of all the times that we're asked so often, what are the vulnerabilities of bringing someone into a trafficking situation, which is important to understand. But it's helpful that Heidi gave that reminder too of, well, there's another side to vulnerability and that's strength. And that's that person not only survived whatever it was that was happening that brought them to a very dangerous situation, but also that they survived the dangerous situation, and that there's something so powerful inside that person to have stayed in the abuse, and we could go on and on. I'm sure Heidi could speak to of, what maybe prompts someone to stay for sometimes as long as they do. And in a way, some people may view that as vulnerability, and in a way, it's actually such a tremendous strength. We're not saying, yes, stay in abusive relationships, that's great. What we're saying is, in the meantime, and while you were living this abusive relationship, you were pulling on something inside of you to make it through, and maybe those things cause distortions later in life, right? They cause you to think differently about intimate relationships or friendships or whatever it is. But I think it's so important to think of, what was it that pulled you through? That's it's such a scary situation to be in. And then they come out the other side of it. What happened there? And I think that that's such an important thing for us to remember too, is that it's not just vulnerabilities that gets people into these situations, it's also the strength that gets them through it. And we want to really help that person continue to draw on that strength that got them through a very difficult situation. To a degree, we can kind of think about it. If you were able to make it through this horrible situation, what else could you do? You know, how could you kind of redirect that energy, you know, that you're pulling on these like survivor, fight or flight type, you know, impulses? How can we help also, and this is the trauma focused therapy part of it, how can we help you redirect that energy, just as Heidi did, into something that, you know, you'll like in life and will bring you peace and comfort, as opposed to all of this pain and suffering. And so to me, the biggest piece, I think, of trauma focused therapy that we're really working towards is we're honoring the strengths that got them through the trauma, and then we're helping them convert those strengths into something that's meaningful for them, right? Not for anyone else, but what's meaningful for them in life. So I think that Heidi's trajectory is such a great example of that, you know, of how it's not that any of this energy ever went away, it was kind of redirected if we think about it. So anyway, I kind of just want to focus, I think that that's such an important point, that there's another side to the vulnerability coin. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so a question in the chat box. What can parents, families, friends, etc., do to support and assist victims and not going back to the traffickers? I don't know if Heidi or Brian have an answer for that.
I think that a point that we had before is that oftentimes leading up to the abusive situation, something is lacking. So I think that it's really important to identify what that is. And I think that a lot of times it is a sense of support, or necessarily understanding, awareness of what's going on. So I think that um, really just you have to identify why, I guess, they're eloping or they're going into the trafficking situation, or what it is that's appealing about the situation. Like Brian was saying before, what is being provided. Um, for myself, I needed somewhere to stay. She paid for my food. She was paying for my gas. And I was still getting a little bit of money per week. So for myself in the situation when I was just homeless, undergoing a lot of abusive situations, this situation was great. To anyone else who is in a stable situation, who has support, this would not be seen as a great situation. So I think that that's really some of the most important things to look at, is just what is lacking and what are they seeking out in this situation.
I've worked with a lot of people where after leaving a situation, it oftentimes, I think that, I mean, depending on what kind of supports there are and, you know, all sorts of factors, but sometimes what we see is after leaving a situation, typically maybe shelter, some form of shelter, public services is kind of what's next to help reinstate some stability, right? Because, you know, I don't know how many people are actually from New York City in this group. If anyone knows of what New York City social services are like, it's a mixed bag, right? It can be very traumatizing to go through the process, particularly for finding shelter and ultimately permanent housing. Just in and of itself, that can be an extremely traumatizing process. And I bring that up because I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say, maybe I'll just go back. It'd be so much easier than having to deal with this, than having to deal with all these people telling me where I have to be, what time I have to be home, when, you know, I only get $150 a month for food stamps. Shoot, you know, some people, those who were allowed to keep any money, if we're talking, I mean, sex or labor trafficking, for anyone who was allowed to keep the money was far more than $150 per month. So when we talk about also what that person was getting, and then afterwards, right, that life actually, in some respects, is far more difficult. I think that we have to pay special attention to that systemically, we do not have the resources to properly support every person who has been through this situation. And so I think that we have, as a society, we can start with, you know, New York City residents. Why is that the case? right? We're not wondering, we don't need to wonder why, what brought them into that situation. I mean, we can, but why can't we help all of them? I think that's the question that we should be asking. Where is the help? Why isn't it enough? And sometimes it is. I'm not saying every single person it's that they wish that they could go back. Certainly not. But what I'm trying to say is that we do see a lot of times people who there was just something about it. As abusive as it was, as scary as it was, there was still stability. There was more often a time where you could put your head down somewhere at the end of the night. So, we're not talking about complicated things here. We're talking about shelter and food and love, you know what I mean? So if we're talking about what happens after, well, what happens after, that kind of depends on us, and how as a society we can support people in these situations. Right now, we're getting there, but it's still not quite there. So anyway, a bit of a tangent, but also, the prevention of getting them back into that's all of how we prevent them from going back to the situation. Exactly what Heidi was just saying. What brought you there in the first place? There's kind of a term in therapy where to some degree you're trying to get someone back to a previous level of functioning, right? If the person who's sitting in front of us has no recollection or has no history of ever having stable functioning, what are we working towards? In that sense, we kind of have to teach people, what does stability look like, right? Sometimes people come from homes where there is no stability. So when we're asking them, how does this feel in a shelter, in a safe environment? Of course they're petrified because they've never experienced a safe environment. They've never experienced a situation in which they've consistently been safe, they've consistently been fed, and they've consistently had somewhere to sleep. So, we want to be mindful of where they're coming from, because if they're coming from a place where they don't even know what that means to have a bed, well, then how are we going to expect them to stay in that bed, afterwards? So anyway, I know I'm seeing a lot of questions come in, so I want to be able to get to them, but that's kind of my take on it.
Thanks, Brian. So I guess in your opinion, are there advocacy issues that you would like us to pursue that would support individuals who have been trafficked and to prevent others from being trafficked?
I'll let you take this, Heidi, and then I'll go.
I think one thing that I wish that I knew when I was going through all of these situations is that there are things like advocates that come to hospitals or that can meet you or that can go places with you. Because like Brian was saying, there's so many times, if I tried to go through the processes that are required by a victim when I had first gone through the situation, there's no way that I would have gone through with any of the processes or fight it as hard as I did. It was really like 4 or 5 years after a lot of the things that I experienced when I was starting to heal, when I was in counseling, when I really started going through these processes, the OVS process, trying to receive justice through the police, trying to do all of these different things. And, it's not immediate, and you have to really, really fight just for the bare minimum as a survivor, and prove every little aspect of your story and why you deserve whatever it is that you're trying to receive, whether it's a service or a small compensation or whatever. And it's just made so difficult for no reason. Hold on. What was the question? Oh, advocacy issues. So I think that what's important is that when I went through that situation, I was already in the field. So I was very aware of certain advocacy groups and, just your rights as a victim and things like that. But had I not been in the fields, because I wasn't when I first started going through these situations, I would have never known that all of these things were out there. And for someone to go through it alone, it's not necessary for someone to go through this alone. there's advocates and groups like Safe Horizon out there for a reason, and they should have someone that is experienced in these processes and what everything looks like, and being able to provide victims with all of their options and all of their rights, because oftentimes, depending on where you go, it can become very skewed. You know, if you go to the police, they're going to tell you that you have to do X, Y, and Z. But if you go to the hospital, they're going to tell you you have to do X, Y, and Z. If it's a forensic exam, you know, depending on what their motivation is, it might not give the victim all of the information that they need to make a decision. You know, if someone knows, I can get a forensic exam to prove that this happened to me, but I don't have to report to the police right away. They can hold on to my kit. If they know something like that, maybe they can make a more informed decision, as opposed to someone saying you have to do this and you have to report to the police right away and this is what you have to. If you have an advocate with you that can say, no, that's not what this person is comfortable doing, we spoke about it and they would feel more comfortable doing this. If you have someone else that can be your voice and be providing you with information you need to make the best decision for yourself, I think that's what's most important, is just people realizing that there's these services out there and being able to utilize them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like Heidi, I also used to work. We'll connect after this and see, you know, where we both work together, maybe. But I also used to be a rape crisis advocate at an emergency room, and very similarly, you know, I think that the saying, you know, knowledge is power, very much applies here, and that the more information, the more times that you all invite Eva to your agencies and your schools and your anywhere that she's welcome. That's another prevention, right? Is that human trafficking is still relatively like new in our kind of understanding of what it is. I mean, it's only been a federal crime for about 20 years. 2001, you know, we're talking about the 21st century, that human trafficking was finally codified into law, and that it's not, you can't do that. So we're still coming up on what is it, you know, especially when it comes to labor trafficking. People are so unaware, you know, and that the media, all these things that contribute to our perception of what trafficking is, especially sex trafficking, you know, it's such a sensationalized thing. And that it, you know, they both happen. They're both just as prevalent. And yeah, so with advocacy issues, you know, the best thing I can say is that knowledge is always going to win over anything. That the more information someone has, the more psychoeducation someone has, what is it that happens when trauma starts to affect you, right? We know that it affects the brain. We know that it affects the way that the people react to, you know, to maybe scary situations, right? We've all seen maybe someone or somewhere experience PTSD. And again, it's understanding it, you know. I think that's always going to be the number one thing that anyone will ever say. No, just continue to learn more about it. Continue to know what are your local, like what Heidi was saying, I think that that's extremely important, right? What are your rights? If you walk into a hospital and you need services, what are your rights? I can guarantee you that the more that someone knows about what their rights are when it comes to the police, when it comes to hospitals, even no matter how old they are, it's going to make a big difference. Because otherwise, again, we go back to the central theme of all of this, which is isolation. The less you know, the more you're going to rely on the person who's feeding you bad information, which is typically the abuser. No one's going to believe you. No one's going to help you. No one's going to do anything for you. Reverse it a bit. Actually, there are people out there. There are places. There are advocates in the emergency room who have to arrive within 30 minutes by law if you arrive and report having been sexually assaulted or abused. So, you know, there are these, I mean, I say little things, but they're not little, but they are, you know, these kind of small little policies that maybe makes that person feel just a little more inclined to seek help. So, you know, it's such a little time to share all of this information, but all of these things that we can share with someone, I think it just makes it all that much better for them to make their own decisions. You know, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Because otherwise, how much different are we than the traffickers if we're telling them what to do? and we're telling them how to live their lives. We want to be helpful. We want to give them, support and suggestions, that are helpful. Not, you have to do this, because then, how are we different in that regard? By telling them what to do, by forcing them to do what they don't want to do.
Thank you, Brian. There was a question in the chat box on any suggestions on how us as parents can talk to our children about trafficking. One thing that I do stress during training is that anyone can be a trafficker and anyone can be trafficked. And one thing as a parent, I'm a parent myself, and I remember growing up, the adults in my life will always tell me about stranger danger. And as Brian mentioned earlier, oftentimes and not, a person is trafficked by someone that they already know, and or someone that they get to know because they're being groomed, and now there's some type of rapport and this trust. And so we have to talk to our children about how this can happen right in our own families. It can happen at our neighbor's house. It can happen at the school. It can happen down at the store. It can happen at the community center. We want to make sure that we tell them that if someone offers them money to do certain things that they don't want to do, to come back and tell you so that you can be able to report it. And maybe Brian will want to piggyback off of that as well, and Heidi, so we have to be very mindful that it's not always the stranger, it's not the one that's going to come and grab them and abduct them and run away, and hide them. It's someone that they may visit often. I had read a story about a little girl who was 6 years old at the time of her trafficking situation, where it was happening at the neighbor's house. And she was going over every weekend to spend the night. And I think it was like an older relative of the person. It was not even an older relative, but just older than them. He probably was like in his early 20s that was trafficking them. And then he had his friends come over. And they were told not to say anything. And when they went to bed at night, to lie and say that they weren't feeling well, and then sneak out the house and come right back over. And that's how the situation was occurring. So we want to be very mindful of, yes, of course, stranger danger, but also that it can happen on the internet. It can happen, especially now with a lot of us working and going to school virtually. We have people that are recruiting online. We want to talk about cybersecurity, and that it may be anyone. Someone's offering them money, or they're coercing them, or they're forcing them, or they're threatening them to do something that they don't want to do. Then they should tell us, or they should report it to someone that, hopefully that is going to listen. And you want to give them the information that I've been going back and forth on the slides. There's numbers that they can text, there are numbers that they can call. And hopefully, if they're in the RTF or CR, so there was a question about that as well, that they want to tell someone at the program that someone is doing something to them at the same program. It could be their own counselor, it could be their caregiver, it could be a guardian, it could be their teacher, their coach, the person that runs the store. We have communities where people that come from other countries, they have families that own restaurants or businesses, and they're being made to work there. They're domestic workers. I mean, the list goes on and on. So we want to make sure that we're familiar with the situations that can arise, so that way we can then educate the children, that we're taking care of, or in our communities as well.
Also, I think just by, asking this question, I don't know who this person is, or your child, or your relationship with your child, but to me, just the fact that you're even asking this question would make me believe that there's maybe some sort of relationship with the child where they could come to you, that it's open and secure. We can stress this point over and over and over again, that the more closed off anyone is as a parent to anything that their child has to say, especially something that's very scary and very serious, is going to me really just be the first thing that says whether or not they're even going to hear you on human trafficking, and the dangers. And I mean, I hate to say that, like, danger lurks around every corner, look out for everyone. We certainly don't want to say, just be a recluse and live inside all your life. But we certainly know of, just being cautious, right? Yeah, exactly what Heather said exactly here, right? Don't live in fear, but, wear those cautionary glasses. It's unusual for someone to be offering a child money, right? It's unusual for some of these things that we see to be actually happening. And so, if you see these red flags, if you see that your child is wearing things that are different than what you bought them, or, you know, all these other red flags that we can kind of point to. That's also a time when, you know, of course, to really notice and pay attention. But even as even, you know, ahead of time, you know, I think it's important just to talk about that, right? To talk about sex, to talk about healthy relationships, to talk about, right, all these things that, again, may lead someone into something that they shouldn't be in. So I think that the conversation isn't just about human trafficking. I think the conversation is much more wide-ranging, right? What does a well-paying regular job look like? You know, I mean, even for when we're talking about labor trafficking, you know, what should you get paid? What should you not be getting paid? What should you be doing when you are at work? You know, what should you not be doing when you're at work? We all, you know, we're all here working professionals. You know, I'm sure some of us have had jobs that, you know, were terrible, you know, but we also now know at this point what we should and shouldn't be doing. And so I do think that there is, you know, it's not just about human trafficking, it's also about healthy relationships and consent. Oh my gosh, consent, you know, that to me is the number one thing in all of this is what can they do with their body? What can someone else do with their body? If anything, you know, the idea is nothing without their permission. But those are all things, especially when we're talking about disabled kids. I think that consent for disabled, especially physically disabled kids, is so important because of this, you know, that's a vulnerability. I think that when we're talking about consent, lack of, I know that there have certainly been times where I've seen parents, you know, perhaps be a bit more cautious to talk about sex with their children. Or so anyway, I just encourage these other topics as well, more than anything, than human trafficking. You know, we don't want to scare them. If you don't think that they're involved in human trafficking, let's talk about the other things that might lead to it, right? So that to me is, I think, just to back up a bit, that's kind of where it starts.
I wanted to add to what you were saying, Brian. So I think that, like you guys were saying before, it's usually someone that the person knows, even someone that the person trusts and loves. So I think that, going back to what we were saying, it's really important that if they do decide to try to disclose to you, that you believe it, because I've seen so many situations where the child isn't believed because they said that it was an uncle. That's the fun uncle, he would never do that, and you can't even imagine that he would do that. But if a child is saying that there's something wrong, or, you know, I think that the conversation is more so surrounding, you know, even people, like you guys were saying, even people that you know and love can still hurt you. If someone is telling you, you know, that you shouldn't be telling me something, that's not usually a good sign. You should probably tell me that what they're telling you. Because I don't think I've ever been in a situation as a child or an adult where someone told me not to tell someone something and it ended up being a good situation. Especially, you know, that's how kind of the grooming and trust situation starts, is, you know, you're not allowed to have chocolate bars because your mom's really healthy, so I'm going to give you chocolate bars, but don't tell her. And then the chocolate bars turn into something else. So I think it's really important for the children to understand, you know, what is a normal relationship and what is not a normal relationship, and what is okay and what is not okay. Especially someone who is disabled, just making very clear boundaries, because I think sometimes the boundaries can be blurred. You know, especially if you're in a residential facility, or if you're, you know, being treated by caretakers that you don't necessarily know very well. There's a very high turnover in fields like this. So you may have very new people, you know, changing your diaper or showering you or doing different things. And it's very hard to explain to people what is okay in those situations and then what becomes sexual or inappropriate. So I think all of those things are good to think about depending on the situation and the child's. But definitely just believe them and maintain an open mind, especially if they're trying to tell you something. Because the moment that you show that you're not going to believe them, they're not going to come to you anymore.
Thank you. There was a question posted by Pam. What if I, as a parent, believe that my teenager is already involved in some type of trafficking, but due to their age, I cannot get any assistance in getting them to come home or to seek treatment?
And I'll go. You know, it kind of reminds me of substance use in a big way, right? If anyone here has ever knows someone, or you yourself has ever had a very serious substance use issue, right? When we're talking about a point where someone, I guess it depends, because teenager, I mean, if they're 18, 19, then right, they're, you know, an adult. I guess in 17 in New York, you're considered an adult too. You know, the thing to consider with a lot of mental health in New York, especially a lot of places in the city, is that in terms of consent, you know, we look at what's called informed consent. So the child doesn't need to have the parent's permission if they are of sound mind to consent to the services. That's inclusive of medical services at the hospital. So the place that Heidi and I worked, you know, 16, 17-year-olds could have easily come in and their parents would not have found out. And we would not have been obligated to report to their parents what had happened. And so I want to make that clear, just in terms of the laws are kind of against parents in that degree. That, you know, the way that the laws are written is that you actually don't, even for maybe a 15-year-old, you know, depending on how mature the child can present themselves. Actually, there are times when we've seen even there was, I think, a 13-year-old who was able to consent to services in the hospital for an exam. And they did not want their parents to know because they were afraid that their parents were going to harm them, or they were afraid that they were going to punish them. I don't know, you know, sometimes kids think that anyway, even if the parent is the nicest person in the world, and they think that they're going to go home and their parents are just going to rip into them. And, you know, so basically my point is that if your child is at a point where there is really nothing, the police are not going to help, ACS is not going to help, as horrible as it sounds, there is a degree where we kind of treat it like substance use, where I love you, you are always welcome in my home, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. You always have a bed here, and you are always safe here. Beyond that, we do have it, and I believe me, we've had so many parents call us and saying, "What do I do?" You know, they're off running around the streets with their boyfriend, and I can't do anything about it. And believe me, as terrible as it sounds, because I don't want this to be the case either, we kind of have to. They're at an age where, although the decisions they're making may not really be their own decisions because they're with someone who's abusive, maybe they're coming from an environment where they never really felt like they could make choices for themselves, and so now they're with this person who's making choices for them. So we have to consider that there's this other person in the mix that we don't know. There's this other person in the mix who's abusive, who's manipulative, and who's telling that person, no, you need to stay here, or else. Or if you go home, your mom is going to, you know, beat you up, or she's just going to kick you out anyway, you're just going to come back here. So it's less on, and yes, so it's less on, you know, that the child, you know, doesn't want to come home. It's more that there's probably someone telling them not to come home. And that's the part that's frustrating for us, even. I mean, believe me, we don't want to see anyone trafficked, but we also recognize that there's this other force in this person's life that just slowly we have to break down, right? The messages from parents, constantly calling, message, constant support, right? As I'm saying this, I'm frustrated with the response because it's not enough. However, it is after a certain age, we also just by law have to respect that aspect of it. Heidi, I don't know if you have thoughts on this also, you know, and I guess what it would have been like if someone told you, you know, you have to come home or you have to do this. But that's kind of the way I see it. And eventually people do seek help. You know, we see Heidi, she eventually sought help, right? You know, eventually things happen. It's just after a certain age, we have to respect their age and the law. And that's kind of, I guess I'm saying that just because that's where I am as a social worker in an agency setting, that I know what I can do as my limits. As a parent, you know, there are limits too. I mean, you know, as you confront them, there's only so much you can say or do, but what you can do and what you can control is how you receive that person when they're ready. So anyway, I'd love to hear what Heidi has to say.
Yeah, I was gonna just add that I think often when a situation is mandated, there's just kind of an immediate defense and almost like opposition or rebellion to what you are trying to get them to do. It's really about the approach, because even if you're trying to get them to do something, if you're making it seem like, you know, you're on their side and you would really like them to do this for this reason, and just kind of guiding them, as opposed to saying, you have to do this, there's no option, like, this is what's happening. And they feel like they have no control over the situation. I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about is about empowering and, you know, providing information and knowledge and focusing on strengths. And I think that if you approach it in a way where it's almost like you can make it as though they're making the decision, but, you know, I think a lot of people don't take the time to do that because, right, that takes a lot of time. That might take some talking to them, some convincing, as opposed to just saying, I'm the parent, you're the child, this is what's happening, or, you know, this is the situation, so this is what has to happen. Because more often than not, nothing's going to come out of that situation. There's not necessarily going to be the same growth as it would be if it's almost like they're consenting, like Brian said, if they're consenting to what's happening, if they're consenting to finally receiving services or to changing their situation, and they're kind of in control of what's happening, or at least it seems that way. I think it's really just all about the support and the approach.
Thank you for that, Heidi. And you kind of answered the next question that Susan posted. So she states that you've had such good information and insight to share, and she's wondering, being a parent, what could she say to parents? Okay, wait, what would you say actually? What would you suggest to parents that we may not be thinking to ask and know what I don't know what I don't know, if that makes any sense, pardon. I wonder, being a parent, what would you suggest to parents that they may not be thinking to ask because they don't know what they don't know?
I think that what's important is just maintaining open communication. I know, like, that can be difficult with teenagers or middle schoolers or whoever you may have in your house, but I think just making sure that they know that you're present, and that you're, you know, that you're interested in them, that you're supporting them, and they just feel like you're there. It just makes a huge difference, regardless of if they're going through trafficking or something else in their life. I think just, you know, we keep going back to like support and all of that, but just having someone that you know you can come to, or at least, you know, providing them with the information that you may learn today or in the sessions that you've been going to, you know, if you ever don't feel comfortable coming to me about something, because I understand that I'm your parent, you can call these numbers, this hotline, you can reach out to these people and they can explain to you how you can get help. Because like Brian said, a lot of times they can seek out services without having to let a lot of people know if they're not quite ready to do so. Because even when my mom and I reconnected and, you know, we had a good relationship, I didn't necessarily feel the need to tell her, yeah, I was in a trafficking situation. You know, she knew that I was in a bad situation, but I didn't feel the need to self-disclose. So I think that that's just one of the main things I would say.
Thank you. We have less than 10 minutes to go for this panel today. Are there any other questions or comments by anyone in the room? Okay, there was some information that I had put in the chat box earlier. So if you all are interested in reading the federal law that Brian had mentioned earlier, you can look up the Trafficking Persons Protection Act, TVPA of 2000. Also, any statistics or research, you can look on polarisproject.org. I had to put that information in the chat box as well. I had lost my sharing capabilities, pardon, I don't know what happened, so I'm not able to post our information back up. But again, if you're interested in any information that we spoke about today, a presentation for any of your own organizations or jobs or anything, wherever you are and within New York State, please email me and we can set up a workshop or a presentation, a training. Brian is also available and so are the other social workers, and we can also have a legal presentation. So we have social work presentation, legal presentation, and also a human trafficking 101 presentation if you're interested. And there should have been the information for our program in the chat box. You can contact us via email. You can call the intake line or the general line. I'll put the number here just now. Diana, do you have any closing words?
I just want to say that before I leave to go on to another Zoom, I want to thank everyone for attending this wonderful, informative webinar. I want to thank you, Eva. I want to thank you, Heidi, Brian, Anita, Safe Horizons, for supporting us and answering these really delicate questions. You guys were wonderful, and we took a lot from this webinar. And I sincerely thank you, and Families Together also thanks you as well. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. Please keep safe and share the awareness, share this with whoever you can, and please have them ask for a presentation. We want to get as many people as educated as possible. You'd be amazed as who doesn't know what's going on. They see it going on and they have their own biases of who it happens to, but this can happen to just about anyone. It doesn't matter race, it doesn't matter your socioeconomic background, it doesn't matter your education. It can happen to just about anyone, by anyone. So please spread the awareness and have them reach out to us so they can also have this presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ava.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
You want to stop recording so at least you have the information?
I don't have the capabilities.
Okay. All right. So I'll stop.
Okay, thank you.
All right.